Portland was wrapped in one of its endless gray rains, the kind that blurred the city's edges until everything looked half awake. In a narrow apartment near East Burnside, the light that filtered through the blinds was pale and cold. Julia Dawson stood at the kitchen counter, sleeves rolled up, rinsing dishes one by one. The water was lukewarm, the same temperature as the silence in the room. She moved slowly, favoring her left leg, the one that never quite followed the rhythm of the other. She was 32, but her reflection in the dark window looked older, worn by years of trying to stay invisible. The sink dripped. Somewhere in the living room, a muted TV played an old rerun. The smell of beer and fried food lingered in the air, even though she had opened the window an hour ago. Her mother-in-law, Agnes, sat at the table with a crossword and a cup of tea she never finished. "You should be grateful Michael puts up with all this," she said casually, not looking up. "Most men wouldn't be so patient." Julia didn't answer. She had learned that silence hurt less than words. Agnes sighed dramatically. "When I was your age, I ran a household, raised 2 children, and still had time to bake bread every morning. You, dear, can barely stand for long. It's a pity." Julia dried her hands on a towel, folded it neatly, and placed it beside the sink. "Dinner's ready," she said quietly. "I already ate," Agnes replied. "Michael brought takeout yesterday. You didn't need to cook again." Julia didn't mention that the takeout had been cold leftovers. She set a plate anyway. When the door opened, Michael came in, shaking rain off his jacket. His boots left wet prints on the linoleum. "Smells like cabbage again," he muttered, dropping a plastic bag of beer cans onto the counter. "Jesus, Julia, can't you cook something normal for once?" "It's stew," she said softly. "Right." He popped open a can and took a long sip. "You know, my coworkers' wives make lasagna or roast. Real food. But sure, stew's fine. Comfort food for cripples." Agnes chuckled under her breath. "Michael, don't be cruel." But the tone carried no rebuke, only amusement. Julia's hands clenched under the table, nails pressing into her palms. She stared at the steam rising from the pot, wishing it could fog out the sound of their voices. Michael continued, as if her silence irritated him. "You sit at home all day. What do you even do? That so-called design hobby? No one's going to pay you for sketching furniture we can't afford." She swallowed, voice trembling but controlled. "I try to keep busy." He leaned back in his chair. "Yeah, maybe you should keep busy cleaning instead. The bathroom looks like hell." Agnes tooted softly. "Now, Michael, don't talk like that." She tries her best. It's not her fault her leg keeps her from being efficient. The word efficient landed like a knife. Julia nodded once and stood up to clear the plates that hadn't even been touched. She moved carefully, every step measured, familiar, practiced. Outside, rain drummed against the glass. The sound filled the silence between their voices. After a while, Agnes retreated to her bedroom. Michael stayed in front of the TV, watching a game with the volume too high. Julia gathered the last dish and carried it to the sink. Her reflection in the window was pale and tired. She caught her own eyes and looked away. The clock above the stove ticked steadily. 10:22. She used to like that sound once. Now it only marked the hours she'd survived another day. When she finished cleaning, she turned off the kitchen light and stood in the doorway for a moment. Michael hadn't moved. The glow from the television flickered across his face, a man who'd long stopped trying and made it everyone else's fault. He spoke without looking at her. "You know what my mom said today? She said I could have done better. And she's right. A normal man deserves a normal woman." For a moment, Julia thought she hadn't heard him correctly. But he kept watching the screen, eyes flat, voice calm, as if the sentence meant nothing. She didn't respond. She just stood there, letting the words settle like cold ashes inside her. The rain outside grew heavier, sliding down the window like tears she wouldn't shed. Her limp was barely noticeable when she walked away. She reached the small bedroom, closed the door behind her, and leaned against it, breathing slowly. The apartment hummed with the same dull noises: the TV, the rain, the clock, but something in her chest shifted, almost imperceptibly. It wasn't anger yet, not courage either, just the first, fragile crack in the wall of silence she had built around herself. And somewhere, beneath the weight of years of humiliation, a quiet thought began to form, that even broken things could still move, could still find their way toward the light. The living room smelled of beer and takeout. Laughter echoed off the low ceiling, too loud for the small space. Michael sat in the center of it all, legs stretched out, surrounded by two coworkers and a neighbor from downstairs. Their voices carried the easy confidence of men who believed the world owed them comfort. Julia had set the table, refilled the snack bowls, and retreated to the corner of the couch. She tried to make herself invisible. Her limp made moving around the room awkward, so she stayed still, smiling when someone looked her way. Michael waved a half-empty can in the air. "You know what it's like living with a designer who doesn't design," he said, laughing. "It's like having a roommate who collects unpaid bills." The men laughed politely. He wasn't finished. "Nah, seriously, she's my little crippled roommate. Can't even chase me out when I'm late." For a split second, no one reacted. Then one of them snorted, and the others followed. The laughter rolled through the room like static. Julia felt every sound strike her skin. She smiled, an instinct, not a choice, and nodded as if the joke were harmless. But her stomach clenched. She stood up quietly, smoothing her skirt. "Excuse me," she murmured and walked to the kitchen. She stayed there, listening to the laughter fade behind her. The faucet dripped. Her hands trembled as she reached for a towel, pretending to dry dishes that were already clean. Her throat burned, but no tears came. When the last guest left and the door closed, the silence felt heavier than the noise had. Michael tossed the empty cans into a plastic bag, humming off-key. She turned to him, voice barely above a whisper. "Don't talk about me like that." He froze. "What did you just say?" Her heart pounded, but she forced herself to meet his eyes. "Please don't talk about me like that. Not in front of people." The air shifted. His face twisted, not with guilt, but disbelief that she had spoken. Then came the smirk, the one she hated most. "You're sensitive all of a sudden?" It was a joke, Julia. Try not to ruin a good night. It wasn't funny. The smirk vanished. The can in his hand hit the counter with a sharp metallic crack. "Don't start," he warned. "You think I need your lectures after working all week? You sit here all day doing nothing, and now you want to tell me how to talk." "I said it hurt me." He slammed the can down again, harder this time. Beer splashed onto the floor. "Ungrateful," he snapped. "I put a roof over your head. I pay the bills. You'd be nothing without me." She flinched, not from fear of being hit, but from the emptiness in his tone. There was no anger there, just contempt. He turned away, muttering to himself, the word ungrateful repeating like an echo. She stood still for a long moment, watching his back, the broad shoulders that once made her feel safe. Now they looked like a wall, cold, impenetrable, and final. When he finally left for the bedroom, the apartment went silent again. Julia crouched to wipe the spilled beer, but her knees gave out halfway down. She sat on the cold linoleum, back against the counter, breathing through the tightness in her chest. The tears came quietly. They weren't the kind that begged for comfort. They came from the simple realization that there was nothing left to fix. The worst part wasn't the humiliation. It was knowing that he didn't see her anymore, not as a partner, not even as a person. She stayed there for what felt like hours. The ticking clock, the only sound in the apartment. 11:23. Each tick felt heavier than the last, as if counting down to something inevitable. She wiped her face, stood up, and turned off the light. The reflection in the window caught her, the outline of a woman sitting in a room that no longer felt like hers. When she lay down that night, The clock in the living room was still ticking, steady and merciless. Every sound marked a choice she hadn't yet made. Tick, another breath. Tick, another hour. Tick, another piece of her breaking free. And as the rain whispered against the glass, Julia stared into the dark and knew, even if she couldn't say it yet, she would not stay here forever. The next morning, the rain had thinned into a silver mist. Portland looked washed clean for once, as if the city itself had taken a deep breath. Julia sat at the small kitchen table, sipping lukewarm coffee from a chipped mug when her laptop chimed. Her inbox was usually filled with newsletters she never read or bills she couldn't bear to open. But this time the subject line froze her in place. Invitation for interview, Harmony Design Studio. She blinked, thinking it must be a mistake. Harmony Design Studio was one of the firms she used to admire from afar, the kind that turned ordinary apartments into art. Her hands shook slightly as she clicked the message open. Dear Ms. Dawson, we came across your design portfolio online and were impressed by your spatial concept sketches. We would like to invite you for an interview this Thursday at 10 a.m. Best regards, Anna Roberts, Creative Director, Harmony Design Studio. For a long moment, Julia just stared at the screen. That portfolio! She'd uploaded it almost 4 years ago, back when she still believed she might have a future in design. Since then, it had gathered digital dust, unseen and forgotten. Until now. Her first instinct was disbelief, then fear. She closed the laptop slowly, her pulse quickening. It's probably a scam, she thought. Or a mistake. Maybe they meant someone else. But then the sunlight, rare, golden, and tentative, cut through the thin curtains, landing on the edge of the table. It felt almost like a sign. Julia exhaled, long and shaky. She opened the laptop again. The email was still there, the words unchanged. For the first time in years, a spark of possibility flickered inside her. She walked to her tiny closet and pulled open the door. Rows of faded clothes greeted her, practical, colorless, chosen more for comfort than hope. In the back hung a navy blue dress she hadn't worn in years. The fabric smelled faintly of lavender in time. She held it up against herself in the mirror. It still fit mostly. She adjusted the hem so it would cover her left leg, the one that made her limp visible. Her eyes lingered there. No matter how long it had been, she could never quite shake the shame that came with it. When Agnes came into the kitchen, Julia was ironing the dress. "What's this?" Agnes asked, her voice thick with suspicion. "I have an interview," Julia said quietly. A design studio reached out. Agnes chuckled. "A design studio? You? Oh, Julia, they probably just need a sympathy case. Someone to tick a charity box." Julia's hand tightened on the iron handle. "Maybe," she said, keeping her voice even. Moments later, Michael emerged from the bedroom, buttoning his shirt. "What's going on?" "Your wife's going to play career woman," Agnes said. "Can you imagine? At her age, with that leg." Michael smirked. "Harmony, huh? Don't embarrass yourself, Julia. These places want people who can handle clients, not someone who can't even walk straight for 10 minutes. Julia didn't answer. She folded the dress carefully and carried it to the bedroom. Behind her, she could still hear their laughter. It sounded small, brittle, like the kind of noise people make when they can't imagine the world changing. She sat on the edge of the bed, smoothing the fabric over her knees. The fear was still there, heavy and familiar, but beneath it was something else, defiance. The old Julia would have backed down, made excuses, waited for another time that never came. But now she couldn't stop thinking about that email, about someone out there, a stranger, who had seen her work and believed it was worth something. She glanced at the clock. If she left now, she could take the bus downtown and still have time to find the building. Maybe even sit outside a few minutes to calm her nerves. In the mirror, her reflection looked almost like someone else, cautious but awake. She adjusted the collar of the dress and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. The apartment was quiet again, The TV was off. The only sound was the steady drip of rain outside. Julia stood up, took a deep breath, and whispered to her reflection, "Just one step at a time." Her voice was soft, but it carried a weight she hadn't felt in years, not a plea, but a promise. She grabbed her coat, slipped on her worn shoes, and walked toward the door. For a second, her hand hesitated on the knob. Then she straightened her back, exhaled slowly, and opened it. The hallway smelled of damp concrete and old paint. The air was cold against her face. As the door closed behind her, the apartment seemed to shrink into silence. Outside, the rain had stopped, and somewhere between the gray clouds, the first fragile hint of sunlight broke through. Julia stepped into it. The building that housed Harmony Design Studio stood on a quiet street lined with maple trees, their wet leaves glistening under the Portland drizzle. Through the glass doors, Julia could see a warm, golden light spilling from inside. Not the harsh white glare of an office, but something softer, almost alive. She hesitated before stepping in, her pulse steady but quick. The reception area smelled faintly of cedar and coffee. Clean lines, muted tones, a vase of wildflowers on the counter. Every detail whispered of care, not extravagance. "Good morning," said the receptionist with a friendly smile. "You must be Ms. Dawson. Ms. Roberts is expecting you." Julia nodded, adjusting the strap of her worn handbag. "Thank you." As she followed the receptionist down the hallway, her heels clicked lightly against the polished concrete floor. Framed photographs of completed projects hung on the walls. Minimalist kitchens, sunlit nursing homes, spaces that looked both elegant and kind. Inside a glass-walled office, a woman stood waiting by a long oak table. She was in her mid-40s, her presence calm but commanding. This was Anna Roberts. Her gray blazer and loose scarf gave her a quiet confidence that felt magnetic. "Julia Dawson," Anna said warmly, extending her hand. "It's good to finally meet you. I've looked through your sketches. They're different, in the best way." Julia shook her hand carefully. "Thank you. I wasn't sure anyone still saw them." Anna smiled. "We don't forget talent. Please sit." The conversation began easily, questions about her past projects, her inspirations, her approach to interior design. Julia answered as honestly as she could. Her voice trembled at first, but steadied as the minutes passed. She spoke about her fascination with how people feel in a space, not just how it looks, how furniture placement could make someone in a wheelchair feel independent, how lighting could ease the anxiety of a small room. Anna leaned forward, intrigued. "You think like a behavioral designer, not just a decorator. That's rare." Julia hesitated. "I haven't worked in years," she said softly, "but I never stopped learning. I read journals, took online classes, tried to keep up." Anna's expression softened into something that felt almost like admiration. "That's what we value the most here, people who don't stop learning." For the first time in a long while, Julia felt the warmth of genuine respect. It startled her more than pity ever had. Anna walked to her desk, picked up a folder, and handed it over. "We're starting a new initiative, accessible design for senior housing. Most firms treat it like a checklist. We want empathy, not just compliance. Would you be willing to take on a small test project?" Julia blinked, her breath catching. "You mean as part of the interview?" Anna smiled. "As part of the team, if it goes well." Julia took the folder in both hands, her fingers trembling slightly. "I'd love to." "Good," Anna said, standing. "We'll be in touch soon." "And Julia," Julia looked up, "don't underestimate what time and hardship can teach you. Sometimes they make better designers than any degree." When Julia stepped out of the building, the rain had returned, light, steady, familiar. The air smelled of wet asphalt and freedom. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, the folder pressed against her chest, her reflection shimmering faintly in the puddle by her feet. For the first time in years, she didn't feel small. She felt possible. Her phone buzzed. The name on the screen made her stomach twist. Michael. She hesitated, then answered, "Hello." His voice came through, sharp and impatient. "Where the hell are you?" "At an interview." He laughed, that low, dismissive laugh she'd memorized. "Right. Playing office again? You think anyone's going to hire you? Don't bother coming home if you think you're better than us." Julia didn't respond. She could hear the TV blaring behind him, Agnes's voice in the background, the same stale noise she had lived in for years. She hung up slowly, staring at the gray sky above. Cars passed, spraying fine mist into the air. One headlight beam caught her face for a brief second, a flash of brightness cutting through the drizzle. Her coat clung to her shoulders, her hair damp, but her eyes no longer looked afraid. She stood there, the phone still in her hand, the city moving around her, and realized that this very moment, was the first step through the door she'd been too afraid to open. The rain kept falling, but it no longer felt like a weight. It felt like baptism. She slipped the phone into her bag, pulled the collar of her coat higher, and started walking. Each step echoed on the wet pavement, uneven, imperfect but steady. Behind her, the glow of Harmony Design Studio faded into the mist. Ahead, the city stretched, wide and unknown. Julia didn't know what waited for her next. She only knew that she wasn't walking home. The apartment Julia found was small, barely more than a single room with a narrow kitchenette and a window that looked out over a tangle of rooftops. But it was hers. The rent was cheap, the walls were uneven, and the heater rattled when it turned on, yet the silence inside belonged to no one but her. She placed a small vase on the windowsill, filled it with wild daisies she bought for $2 at a corner market, and for the first time in years, the air didn't smell like resentment. She slept on a mattress on the floor that first night, wrapped in an old quilt. The city hummed outside, distant traffic, soft rain against the glass. Julia lay awake, not from fear, but from the strange calm that came with solitude. Freedom didn't feel like a grand victory. It was quieter, smaller, the simple relief of not having to flinch at every sound. The next morning, she arrived early at Harmony Design Studio. The office was bright with natural light, walls painted a soft ivory, the faint scent of cedar polish in the air. Colleagues passed her with friendly nods, some stopping to introduce themselves. No one looked at her limp. No one pitied her. They just talked about projects, deadlines, color palettes, normal things, ordinary things. Anna greeted her at the entrance to the open workspace. "Julia, come, I'll show you where you'll be working." Her desk was by a large window overlooking the street, sunlight spilling across the surface. A stack of material samples sat waiting. Soft fabrics, wooden textures, photos of assisted living interiors. "We've reviewed your proposal sketches," Anna said. "I want you to take the lead on this prototype apartment for our senior accessibility project. Don't overthink it. Just design something that feels kind." Julia blinked, unsure she'd heard right. "You mean I lead?" Anna smiled. "Yes. You understand what comfort means better than anyone else here. Trust that." Julia nodded, her throat tight. "I will." The first few days passed in a blur of work. She threw herself into it, sketching layouts, experimenting with furniture height, testing colors that calmed rather than overwhelmed. She worked late, often forgetting to eat. Every time doubt crept in, she remembered Anna's words, "You understand comfort." By the end of the week, she presented her first draft. The conference room was filled with gentle chatter as her colleagues gathered around. She explained her design, how wide hallways could still feel intimate, how natural light could create a sense of safety for those who feared falling. Her voice trembled at first, but steadied as she spoke. When she finished, Anna leaned back in her chair and studied the sketches for a long moment. Then she looked up and said softly, "You have empathy in your work. That's what makes it beautiful." The words hit Julia like a wave. Empathy, not pity, not tolerance. Empathy, the one thing she had always given freely but never received in return. Around her, the others nodded and smiled. Someone asked about material options, Another suggested collaboration on color schemes, normal conversation, professional respect. She smiled back, answering questions, feeling something expand in her chest, something warm, unfamiliar, and almost frightening. When the meeting ended, she excused herself quietly and walked down the hall to the restroom. She locked the door, turned on the faucet, and leaned over the sink. At first, she only stared at her reflection. The fluorescent light was unflattering, but she didn't care. Her cheeks were flushed, her hands trembling. Then, without warning, tears spilled down her face. They came fast, hot, uncontrollable. But she wasn't crying out of sadness. It wasn't grief this time. It was the shock of feeling seen, of realizing that her work, her effort, her existence had finally been acknowledged without mockery. For years, she had learned to shrink herself to fit inside other people's comfort. And now, standing alone in a small restroom with mascara running down her cheeks, she felt something else entirely: space. She pressed a hand to her heart, breathing through the sobs until they softened into quiet laughter. When she finally stepped back into the hallway, no one noticed anything unusual. The office buzzed with life, printers whirring, phones ringing, voices trading ideas. Julia walked past them, lighter somehow, her steps still uneven but more certain. At her desk, sunlight still streamed through the window, hitting the vase of fresh daisies she had placed there that morning. They glowed in the afternoon light, simple, fragile, alive. Julia smiled. For the first time in years, she didn't feel invisible. It happened on a Thursday afternoon. The rain had finally stopped, and the windows at Harmony Design Studio reflected the soft gold of early evening. Julia was finishing a presentation when the receptionist appeared at her desk, pale and uneasy. "Julia, there's a man here asking for you," she whispered. "He says he's your husband." Julia froze. Her pen slipped from her hand. For a second, she thought she'd misheard. Then she saw him, Michael, standing in the lobby, dripping wet, eyes bloodshot, a half-collapsed version of the man she used to know. He stormed toward her before she could react. "What the hell are you doing here?" he barked. "You've been ignoring my calls." Julia glanced around. The entire office had gone silent. Anna had stepped out of her office, her expression composed but watchful. "This is my workplace, Michael," Julia said quietly. "You can't just come here." "You think you're too good for us now," he sneered. "You're my wife, Julia. You belong with me. Let's go." Her co-workers exchanged uneasy glances. Julia stood her ground. "I'm not going anywhere with you." He laughed, a sound sharp enough to cut through the air. "You think you can survive without me? You can't even walk straight half the time." The words were cruel, but they didn't sting the way they used to. They fell flat, powerless. Julia simply said, "Please leave." Anna stepped forward then, her voice firm. "Sir, if you continue this behavior, I'll have to call security." Michael turned toward her, stunned that anyone dared challenge him. "Stay out of this. It's between me and my wife." "No," Anna said calmly. "It's between an employee and her right to work without being harassed." The security guard appeared moments later. Julia didn't remember how Michael left, just the echo of his angry voice fading down the hallway. "You'll regret this." That night, Julia didn't cry. She sat in her small apartment, the quiet pressing close around her, and opened her laptop. Her fingers trembled only once before she began typing. Petition for dissolution of marriage. 2 weeks later, the papers were filed. Michael's reaction was immediate and vicious. He showed up at the courthouse with a lawyer who looked as bitter as he did. "You'll leave with nothing," he hissed at her before the hearing. "The house, the car, everything's mine." Julia looked at him for a long moment, her face calm. "I don't want anything that came from you." He scoffed. "You're pathetic." The hearing itself was quick. The house was indeed under Michael's name. The judge ruled accordingly. Julia received only her personal belongings, clothes, a laptop, and a few tools of her trade. But Anna, who had come to sit quietly in the back of the courtroom, wasn't done fighting for her. When the session ended, Anna walked over and placed a gentle hand on Julia's shoulder. "You did well," she said, "but you shouldn't have to do it alone." Julia frowned. "What do you mean?" "I've already called my attorney," Anna replied. "He'll make sure Michael doesn't use your name or try to damage your credit. You've built something new for yourself. Let's protect it." Julia wanted to protest, but the kindness in Anna's tone left no room for argument. She simply nodded. "Thank you." Outside, the courthouse steps were slick from an earlier shower. The air smelled of wet pavement and clean beginnings. Julia stood there for a moment, the decree folded in her hand, the ink still fresh. Around her, people hurried past, lawyers, couples, strangers, all of them carrying pieces of their own unfinished stories. Julia watched them, then looked down at the paper again. Her name was there, alone now, no longer tied to his. A breeze lifted her hair, cool and steady. She closed her eyes, letting it brush against her face. It wasn't triumph she felt. It wasn't even relief. It was something quieter, the simple rhythm of breathing without permission. In her mind, she heard the echo of Michael's last threat. "You'll leave with nothing." She looked at the paper once more and smiled faintly. Nothing, she thought, has never felt this light. The city's late afternoon light was changing, gray softening into amber, the kind that turned even concrete into something warm. She walked down the courthouse steps, her shoes clicking against the stone, her heart sinking with each sound. Freedom has no furniture, she thought, but it finally has a heartbeat. As she reached the bottom of the steps, the wind picked up again, carrying the faint scent of rain and something new, something alive. Julia lifted her face toward it, her eyes steady, her hand still trembling, but for once, not from fear. For the first time in years, she wasn't leaving somewhere. She was walking toward something. 2 years had passed since the courthouse steps. Time, once heavy and suffocating, now moved with a quiet rhythm, like rain against the window or a heartbeat in sleep. Julia had built a new life, not out of grand gestures or miracles, but from small, deliberate acts of healing. Her apartment in East Portland was no longer a bare room with peeling paint. It was bright now, sunlight spilled through wide windows every morning, catching the soft green leaves of the plants she kept on every ledge. The air always smelled faintly of mint and sawdust from her design samples. A small orange cat named Maple stretched lazily across her drafting table, his tail flicking whenever she reached for her pencil. The space reflected her, imperfect, alive, and quietly proud. Her days were full but calm. She worked at Harmony's newly opened branch, leading a small team that specialized in adaptive interior design, creating homes for people with mobility challenges, sensory sensitivities, or chronic illnesses. The kind of work that required not just creativity, but empathy. Julia had become known in the community for it. Articles had been written. Clients requested her by name. But she never saw herself as successful, only as useful, finally in the right way. One late afternoon, she stood by the large windows of her new office, watching the light fade into the gray-blue of an Oregon dusk. Anna Roberts stepped inside, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. "You're still here," Anna said, smiling. Julia turned and laughed softly. "Old habits. I like to make sure the world hasn't changed while I wasn't looking." Anna handed her a mug and leaned against the desk. "The board just approved your proposal for the community housing project. It's going statewide. You've done something remarkable, Julia." Julia's eyes widened. "Really?" Anna nodded. "You're leading it. It's your vision. Homes that adapt to people, not the other way around." Julia sat down, trying to process the words. 2 years ago, she hadn't even believed she'd have a job, let alone a career that mattered. "Thank you," she said finally, "for everything." Anna took a sip of her coffee, studying her. "You did the work. I just opened a door." Julia smiled faintly, looking out the window again. "You know," she said after a pause, "I used to think broken meant useless." Anna tilted her head. "And now?" Julia turned toward her, her eyes calm, voice steady. Now I know it just means human. The room fell silent for a moment. Outside, car headlights traced golden lines through the mist. Anna nodded slowly. That's the kind of wisdom that makes great designers, she said. After Anna left, Julia stood there for a while, sipping her coffee, watching the city come alive with evening light. Inside her, everything felt balanced, the kind of peace she'd once thought was impossible. She walked home later that night, the streets glistening after a light drizzle. The cafe on the corner still played old jazz records, the smell of coffee drifting into the cold air. When she reached her apartment, Maple was waiting by the door, meowing softly as if scolding her for being late. She laughed, scooping him up. "I'm home, little one." In the quiet of her apartment, she set down her bag, changed into soft pajamas, and lit a small candle on the windowsill. The flickering flame reflected in the glass, mingling with the distant city lights. It was a life she had built from nothing, one slow step at a time. No shouting, no chaos, no cruelty, just warmth, silence, and space to breathe. And yet, as she sat by the window, petting Maple and listening to the soft hum of the city, Julia felt a faint echo of something missing. Not loneliness exactly, more like an empty corner in her heart, untouched, waiting. Freedom had filled her life with peace, but not yet with meaning beyond herself. She looked down at Maple, who was now asleep on her lap, and whispered, almost to the air, "Maybe someday, it'll be time to open another door." Outside, the city lights flickered like quiet promises, and for the first time, Julia didn't feel afraid of what might come next. The email arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning. Julia was reviewing floor plans when Anna stopped by her desk, a folder in hand. "We're partnering with an external architect for the new Rehabilitation Center project," she said. "It's a major contract, adaptive living spaces for patients who've lost mobility after accidents. I want you to co-lead the design phase." Julia straightened, brushing her hair behind her ear. "Who's the architect?" Anna smiled knowingly. "Andrew Parker. He's based in Seattle, but will be working here for the next few months. You'll meet him this afternoon." Julia had heard the name before. Andrew Parker was respected in the field for his minimalist, yet humane approach to architecture. Widowed several years ago, he was known for keeping to himself, letting his work speak for him. By 3 o'clock, the meeting room was set. Julia arranged her notes, the hum of quiet anticipation beneath her calm exterior. The door opened and Andrew walked in, tall, with graying hair at the temples, a neatly pressed shirt, and the quiet composure of someone who carried both authority and loss. His presence didn't demand attention, it invited it. Anna introduced them, then left the two to discuss the design brief. As Julia outlined the initial concept, gentle transitions between private and communal spaces, natural lighting to encourage mental recovery. She noticed he was listening with full focus, not interrupting, not rushing. When she paused, he leaned slightly forward. "You speak from experience," he said softly. Julia hesitated, then nodded. "I understand what it feels like when your own body limits you." It wasn't a rehearsed line. It was truth, quiet and unguarded. Andrew met her eyes, and for a moment neither spoke. There was no pity in his expression, only recognition, the kind that comes from someone who has lived through his own kind of confinement. He finally said, "That's what most designs lack, empathy you can feel in the walls." From that moment, the collaboration began not as a task, but as a conversation. They met daily, sketching ideas on the same notepad, debating layouts, testing materials. Julia found herself drawn to his calm precision. He, in turn, seemed to value her sensitivity to detail. He would often pause while she explained a concept, then quietly translate it into architectural structure, a perfect balance of intuition and logic. One evening, as they reviewed accessibility routes through the building, Julia noticed a scar along his wrist when he reached across the table. She didn't ask about it, but later, as they packed up, he said quietly, "My wife was in a car accident. That's how I got into rehabilitation design. I built her a home she never lived to see. Julia's breath caught. I'm sorry, she said. He nodded once. Don't be. That home is what keeps me building. For a moment, the office felt different, softer, fragile. Julia wanted to say something, but words failed her. Instead, she smiled faintly. Then maybe this project will help someone else find their way home. He looked at her then, really looked, and there was something steady and warm in his eyes. I think it already has, he said. Over the following weeks, their partnership grew natural, almost effortless. They finished each other's thoughts in design meetings, challenged each other's assumptions, and laughed at tiny mistakes that once would have embarrassed her. Julia realized she no longer second-guessed herself when she spoke. She didn't shrink back. Working with Andrew felt like breathing again. One Friday evening, after sending the final blueprint revisions to the client, Julia was closing her laptop when her phone buzzed. A message popped up. Andrew Parker, you make spaces feel like home again. She stared at the screen for a long time, the words glowing softly in the dim light of her apartment. Maple curled at her feet, purring, while rain tapped gently on the window. Julia smiled, a slow, genuine smile that reached her eyes. She typed a reply, then paused, fingers hovering over the keyboard. For once, she didn't feel the need to respond right away. She just sat there, letting the warmth of the moment sink in. Outside, the city lights shimmered through the rain, and for the first time in years, home no longer felt like a place. It felt like possibility. Love, when it returned, did not arrive with thunder. It came softly, like light through curtains on a quiet morning. For months after the project began, Julia and Andrew had fallen into an easy rhythm. They met early to review plans, shared lunches over scattered blueprints, and often stayed late at the office, working in comfortable silence. What surprised her most was how natural it felt. There were no grand gestures, no sudden confessions, just a steady companionship that grew roots without either of them realizing. Sometimes, after long days, they would stop at a small cafe on Burnside Avenue. It became their unspoken ritual. One cup of coffee, one slice of cinnamon loaf. Two lives that had once been broken learning how to exist side by side. Julia liked the way he listened. He never tried to fix her words or fill her silences. When she talked about her design process or her struggles with self-doubt, he simply nodded, thoughtful as if every word mattered. And in return, she learned the quiet art of listening too, to the pauses between his sentences, to the weight of what he didn't say. One evening, the sky outside was washed in pink and violet, the air heavy with the scent of rain. They were sitting across from each other, the cafe nearly empty, when Andrew finally spoke about his wife. She loved the ocean, he said, staring at his untouched cup. After the accident, she couldn't walk anymore. I kept trying to rebuild her world. Ramps, lifts, wider doorways. I thought if I fixed the space, maybe I could fix her pain. But grief doesn't work that way. Julia looked at him, her chest tightening with empathy. It's not something you fix, she said softly. He nodded. I know that now, but I spent years trying to design my way out of grief. Every project since then has been a conversation with her, one she'll never answer. Julia reached across the table, her fingers resting near his, but not quite touching. Her voice was steady. We don't move on, she said. We move forward. He met her eyes then, not with sadness but recognition. For a long moment, they simply sat there, the hum of the espresso machine filling the silence. Outside, the rain began again, tapping gently against the windows. Andrew's hand moved slightly, almost unconsciously, until it brushed hers. It wasn't planned or dramatic, it just happened. The warmth of his palm against her skin felt like a question, and somehow an answer too. Julia didn't pull away. She smiled, small and real. There was no rush, no breathless moment of confession. They didn't speak about what it meant. They didn't need to. Some things, after all, didn't require words. In the weeks that followed, their connection deepened, quietly, carefully. They began to share more of the unspoken corners of their lives. The books that had shaped them, the places they still wanted to see, the memories that still ached when least expected. Sometimes, after work, they walked along the waterfront, where the city lights danced across the Willamette River. Andrew would tell her stories about architecture students who thought beauty could only exist in perfection. Julia would laugh and tell him that imperfection was what made things real, and he'd smile as if she'd reminded him of something he'd forgotten. It wasn't a romance built on fireworks or declarations. It was two quiet lives learning how to hold space for each other. And for Julia, that was everything. One night, after another long day, she came home and stood by her window. The city shimmered below, endless and alive. Maple purred softly at her feet. She thought about how far she had come, from that cramped apartment filled with contempt, from the weight of a marriage that had shrunk her world. She was no longer surviving someone else's cruelty. She was living her own choice. Her phone buzzed, a message from Andrew. "Good night, Julia. Thank you for today." She smiled, setting the phone down. Outside, the rain eased into a soft drizzle, and for the first time, she realized she didn't feel broken anymore. She felt human, whole even. And as she turned off the lights and slipped into bed, Julia understood that love didn't have to rescue her. It simply had to walk beside her. It was a quiet Saturday evening in downtown Portland, the kind of evening when the city glowed like a memory. Rain had passed an hour ago, leaving the streets slick and shining under the golden lights. Julia and Andrew sat near the window of a small restaurant known for its warm bread and jazz softly playing in the background. The air inside was alive with quiet conversation and the clinking of glasses. Julia wore a deep green dress, her hair swept loosely over one shoulder. There was something effortlessly elegant about her, not the elegance of luxury but of peace. Andrew, across from her, was telling a story about his new interns, and Julia laughed, her voice light but full. It had been 3 years since the courthouse. 3 years since she had walked away with nothing but a box of belongings and a heartbeat she wasn't sure would survive. But here she was, whole, unhurried, and quietly radiant. Their food arrived, and as Andrew poured her a glass of red wine, the door opened. A gust of cool air swept through, carrying the faint scent of rain. Julia didn't notice at first, but then she heard a familiar voice, low, careless, loud in the way that demanded attention. Michael. He was laughing with 2 old colleagues, his tone full of that same easy arrogance she once mistook for charm. His hair was thinner now, his face heavier, but it was the eyes that stopped her heart for a moment. Still restless, still searching for someone else to blame. He turned. The laughter died mid-sentence. Their eyes met. For a heartbeat, time folded back on itself. All the years of silence, the nights she'd cried quietly so no one would hear, the words he had thrown at her like stones. All of it stood between them like glass. But this time, Julia didn't flinch. Michael froze, the smirk slipping from his face. He looked at her as if trying to understand who she was. This woman with calm eyes, poised posture, the faintest trace of a smile playing on her lips. He looked at Andrew, too, the way he leaned toward her, the ease between them. Michael's jaw tightened. For a moment he hesitated, his hand twitching as if to wave. Old reflexes, old control. He took a step toward her. Julia felt the motion, sensed it more than saw it. She turned slightly in her chair, her chin lifting just enough. When their eyes met again, she smiled, small, courteous, distant. Then she nodded once, politely, like acknowledging a stranger in passing. And then she turned back to Andrew. "Sorry," she said softly, her voice steady. "You were saying about the new project in Seattle." Andrew smiled, continuing his story as if nothing had happened. But Julia could feel his hand brush lightly against hers under the table. Not possessive, just grounding. Michael stopped mid-step, uncertain. Around him, his friends had gone quiet, sensing the shift. One of them murmured something, but he didn't hear. His gaze lingered on Julia, on the laughter that returned to her face, the warmth in her eyes as she listened to another man speak. For the first time, he saw her not as someone beneath him, but as someone far beyond his reach. The waiter passed between them, breaking the line of sight. When Michael looked again, Julia was laughing, a soft, easy laugh that reached her eyes. It was the sound of someone who no longer remembered how it felt to beg for love. He turned away then, awkwardly. One of his friends said something about ordering drinks, and he nodded without listening. His reflection in the restaurant's glass looked back at him, older, tired, empty. Outside, the rain began again, a slow drizzle that caught the streetlights in silver threads. Through the window, he could still see her. Julia's hand rested near Andrew's, their heads bent together in quiet conversation. The light above their table glowed warm and golden, wrapping them in something that looked like peace. Michael stood there a moment longer, the sound of jazz drifting faintly through the door each time it opened. Then he stepped back onto the wet sidewalk, his shoes splashing through shallow puddles. No one turned to watch him leave. Inside, Julia lifted her glass, smiling as Andrew said something that made her laugh again. For her, the moment had already passed. She didn't think about the man at the door, the years she had lost, or the pain that had once defined her. Those things belonged to another lifetime, one she had already outgrown. The band shifted to a softer tune, a slow piano melody that wrapped itself around the hum of quiet voices. Julia looked out the window for a moment. The rain blurred the city lights into something beautiful and soft, like an old painting. She took a breath, feeling the steady rhythm of her own pulse, calm, strong, certain. Across the table, Andrew was watching her. "You okay?" he asked gently. Julia nodded. "Better than okay." She reached for his hand and he met her halfway. No fireworks, no drama, just warmth. Outside, the rain deepened, cascading against the window in silvery streaks. The reflection in the glass showed two faces side by side, surrounded by light. And somewhere beyond the glass, a man stood motionless, staring in, the water distorting his features until even he couldn't recognize what he'd become. Julia didn't see him anymore. She didn't need to. Her laughter rose softly above the music, not the laughter of victory, but of freedom. Because revenge, she realized, didn't always need noise or fire. Sometimes it was as quiet as living well, as gentle as peace, and as radiant as knowing you had survived everything meant to break you. Outside, the city shimmered under the rain, and inside, Julia Dawson finally smiled like someone who had come home.